What's interesting here is we're going through this. I was looking at the agenda. I said, oh, it'll take us this amount of time to get to my part. What I realized is that we don't have to physically go up and down to the podium. So it actually doesn't take that long to get to this part. I'm glad that I got here on time. So let me go ahead and first say that it's been a joy serving on the council in all of the capacities that one is asked when you get to serve as program chair and then president, past president, and the future roles, serving on the nominating committee and dealing with the awards. One of the things that I was very intentional about whenever I took it on and was working with our leadership team, and in particular John Sporing, was that I wanted to make sure that whatever happened during my tenure, that I would not hurt the association, and not hurting meant particularly financially. And so I was really working hard to make sure that we had a good attendance at the 2019 meetings, and everything worked out great there. It was 2020 that basically had me in a big ball of stress, as John was showing me and looking over the contract and realizing that if we had to cancel that contract without some type of cause, and the that was in that contract, that basically all of the reserves of the association would be gone. It's like, oh, great, the association is going to go bankrupt and solvent on my watch. The last thing I was hoping that would happen. But I want to thank John, all the leadership team that worked to make sure that we were able to get through that period, and that the current leadership that has got us today with this virtual conference, and looking forward to being able to get back together in person in the near future. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm assuming that there shouldn't be any issue with my being able to share my screen. So I'm going to go ahead and do that at this time, and make sure hit the right button there. Share the screen. There we go. I want to talk first a little bit about my own regional science identity. And the idea of identities in regional science was both a reflection on how did I come to regional science, and then as well as what do I see as some of the challenges we need to think about identity as regional science, and the identity of the regions that we build as our unit of analysis for conducting research and providing scholarship decision support around. My childhood was an interesting one. My father was involved in politics, and one of the early elections was for a school board race. We had about 800 people in that district that was split into 10 polling places. And what happened there was that in those polling places back then, I think this was 82, the candidates could go around and provide donuts to all the poll workers. That's considered an ethics violation today, but that was allowed back then. So we went around. It's just a nice thing you did. And there were 10 of these places in this 800 election district. And so they were very small, but what was also interesting was that they all had unique names. They were not just numbers. I remember there was a place called Ebenezer and Spring Hill and Boatner and Walker, and all these names. And I asked my dad, what's the background of these names? And he said, well, these used to be sizable communities, you know, a little bit larger in population. They had places to shop and to eat. Even some of them had schools. And as a result of time, these communities basically, their businesses shuttered, the schools were consolidated, and that the name that was attached to those polling places was the last name to the identity of that place, occasionally sans a road name. And so what happened was that between 82 and 86 was the oil bust in Louisiana, and they consolidated these polling places. And so the 10 went to 2, and that was the last time those names would have been in an official current day record. And so I was, you know, that was an identity of place there, and the vulnerability of that identity. Second came when I was in college as an undergraduate and taking a course in rural development. We were exposed to export-based theory and the idea of basic and non-basic sectors. And you can see in this picture, this is a picture of the the farm supply store business. We sold feed, seed, fertilizer, farm chemicals, things of that nature. And it was the business Dad started for me to have a high school job. I guess it's different ways to do it. Start a business so your son can have work. So did that, learned a lot in that. But one of the things I did learn in looking at the financials was that the financial success of our farm supply stores depended on the financial success that was going on in the paper mill in any given year, because so many of the people that purchased supplies at our store were paper mill employees. These were people that had good wages and things. And so when there were periods where they did layoffs and things because the forest economy and their markets weren't as strong, we felt it. And so I got to realize that we were a non-basic sector and they were the basic sector. And so starting to get these definitions helped to identify the things that I saw in the place where I grew up, sort of to help explain that. Probably then, how did I get from this regional science dimensions in class to SRSA? And I'll have to blame my master's thesis advisor, David Hughes. Took me to a meeting in 1997 in Memphis, Tennessee, and introduced me to, I call it the Clemson Gang Dinner. And this was David Hughes, of course, my advisor at the time, and three of his colleagues from Clemson, the late Jim Hite, late Mark Henry, and David Barkley. And if you know anything about Jim Hite, Jim was a character, a wonderful person to hang out with, and sort of he held court that evening, told lots of stories. So I realized that there was something beyond the idea of the core scholarship, that there was a cohort of scholars that were enjoyable to work with and to be around. And so this was an influential part of me. Then was the idea of taking ownership in regional science. When I did my PhD at Missouri, working under Tom Johnson, he threw me out into the water. I get there 2 weeks into that, and it says, okay, here's some data we collected from Ireland, and here's some secondary administrative data from the country. I need you to go build me a primary database social accounting matrix. It says you'll need to put it together, make sure everything works, balance it, RAS it, do all the fun stuff that you do with this. It's like, okay. So I got thrown in the water real quickly, but that sort of made me take ownership in methods in regional science. Later on, learning to construct spatial econometric models and understanding the role of space in influencing and having causal relationships to certain types of decisions. And then probably at that time, the other thing that brought me, Paul Krugman and his colleagues that were introducing new economic geography that was very new at that time. I attached the core periphery model that they presented. And so these things sort of led me into regional science full time. And so that was my journey in regional science. And one of the things that I want us to think about today is this idea of our how we want to challenge the regional identities that we have in research. I was reminded of several readings that I've had over the years, but one that brought most attention to me was Piketty's book on capital. And in addition to being a long book and a long, hard slog, there were lots of little nuggets that sort of came out for me. One of those is the changing roles of indicators and what was valued. And in the 19th century, wealth assets were well measured, particularly in Europe. And the reason they were was that wealth was what was taxed primarily in that century. And then as we transition to the 20th century, we have the introduction of the income tax. And so what you start to see from a federal data collection perspective, you see this movement away from a heavy focus on measuring wealth on a regular basis to starting to measure income. And we get really good at measuring income. We're able to measure it and break it down into a sectoral dimension, place-based income. We're able to look at it from the household perspective. We're able to break it into lots of different geographies, things of that nature. And so, but we've lost the momentum that was in the 19th century because we measure what we value. And at that time, taxation by those that were funding the statistical agencies was what was value. They value that taxation and they needed to appropriately measure it. Okay. The question then becomes, though, is what is the trade-off? What is the trade-off between using some of these historical indicators that have this path dependence to address today's questions that are sort of front and center in issues around societal challenges, place-based policy, and the like? Should they continue to have the level of influence they have in our own research? I mean, you know, we as an association, and I remember, I mean, we really enjoy going to bat, and granted our colleagues there from BEA, times when things such as the Reese data sets were under attack for the sectoral detail that they were provided because of budget cuts, because we enjoyed the ability to have both the sectoral detail, the geographic detail, and the time series around much of the data in that system. The question, though, is that what is the trade-off by maintaining these variables in the forms that they're in, which may or may not be as valuable today as they were in the past? And so I want us to think about evaluating these trade-offs around three attributes: the attribute of stability, and I think that's somewhat self-explanatory in the sense of having stable definitions of the dimensions of our research so that we can have these time series and panel data sets from which to conduct analyses, against the idea of accuracy. And I mean, this is a challenge that we face, particularly in the context today of dealing with some of the issues around privacy and the issues that have come out in the recent time periods with the 2020 census and differential privacy and dealing with accuracy. How do we look at the stability of maintaining this type of geographic precision that we are able to provide data down at the census block level for this once a decade? And what are the trade-offs in privacy? Just a quick aside, you know, when Facebook drops and 500 million records of users are exposed, we've probably on average they've exposed a lot more privacy information than probably the Census Bureau could with some of their DP measures, but that's just a little aside. Granted, the other side of the equation is that Census is trying to address some of their rules that are in statute for protecting that, so I understand at one level where they're coming from. Finally, the issue of relevance. How relevant is the dimensions of the regions that we measure today, and should we think about the role of updating them or having larger structural changes to them to make them relevant to address today's questions? And so when we think about that, I look at the idea of what has been done to some of these dimensions. And Tom Johnson, my PhD advisor, in his presidential address back in 1993, it's in the Review of Regional Studies in 1994, looked at 4 dimensions around which regional science scholarship was often based. 3 of these I'm highlighting today: the sectoral, the temporal, and the spatial dimensions. And I've looked at these and said, well, what type of structural adjustments have we made over time to these? And this is mostly in the US based context. When we think about this, I've put this in a continuum in a health analogy between preventative care versus surgery, and to think about it. And we've made some of those changes over time. I think probably in the sectoral dimension, for those of us that have been around long enough, we had the major structural change going from SIC codes to NAICS codes, and the inability to have a nice, clean set of bridge tables to bridge that, to make the comparison over time. But there was, at the time, a feeling that the structure of the economy had changed, that the old SIC codes did not measure and break down the economy into the pieces, into the proper different pieces. And so that occurred. Now, that was major inpatient surgery. On the other hand, NAICS does every 5 years do updates to that classification system. These are more minor changes. I put PC there to be more preventative care, and I think that's probably a reasonable approach. And in fact, probably the ability to do that every 5 years allows for a recognition that by doing so, it avoids some of the major structural problems that you might have if you let one of these dimensions go without serious review for multiple decades. Okay, temporal, and we're not sitting here trying to change units of time necessarily, but we do want to look at how some of our major statistical organizations have addressed these temporal issues. And I think, in my mind, going back to the change that we saw after the 2000 census, when we moved from that being the last decade where we used the long form to collect data to using the American Community Survey. Some of the benefits that we had was the idea of moving from some of those data points only being measured to once a decade to now having an American Community Survey, which provided data in some cases more frequently. Now we get to smaller geographic areas and we're dealing with these 5-year average estimates. We don't get the same benefit of leveraging ACS in a traditional sort of panel structure, but we have that. Part of that trade-off was some were confidence intervals that could be very wide around some of these data values. But to Census credit, they're at least reported, so we see them and we're able to evaluate if we want to use those in our research. From a spatial perspective, and I'll focus on metropolitan areas in the United States, and focus on 3 of these. And I've looked back and have evaluated those changes back to the 1950s, but I'll focus on the last 3 decades. What we saw was major, I'll call it major inpatient surgery between 1990 and 2000. This was a period where we went through changing things such as going from allowing political boundaries of a municipality to define the geography from which a core urbanized area was defined, to using census blocks, block groups, or tracts of given population density, and collecting those contiguous blocks and tracts together to get to population thresholds to be the core of an urbanized area of a metropolitan region. So we did that. We moved away from looking at multiple attributes of metropolitan character to simply using commuting thresholds. So those were used as ways, and then major inpatient surgery, and lots of comments generated from that when those changes were made. From 2000 to 2010, I described this as sort of skipping the physical exam. Because there was very little change structurally to the delineation rules in 2010 from what was generated in 2000. And this actually showed up in the federal comments. I mean, they were small and very minor, and that was in the Federal Register for those OMB rules. And then this current decade's proposed changes, I sort of labeled as outpatient surgery. It's sort of like, we're going to keep the underlying structure that OMB developed in 2000, but we're going to change the threshold of urbanized area population for the urbanized areas from 50 to 100,000, and that's going to make certain areas that are metropolitan in the current rule no longer metropolitan. And so what can we do to address these issues of accuracy, stability, and relevance? And a lot of these are things that, as regional scientists, we can't address as much, although I do think that there are opportunities where we can be supportive of the organizations that have responsibilities in data collection and generating these types of secondary data sources that we have. You know, one of the challenges that we see with some of the data, particularly with data that comes from ACS and others, is the challenges that we have with large confidence intervals. and the benefit, the idea of trying to oversample when possible to try to make some more of those data either available because they can't be disclosed because of small numbers, or for certain statistical items, and in cases where they can be disclosed, the confidence intervals to narrow those. Now, in some instances with business data, you can't do that. If there's only 2 business establishments in a given county, of a given NAICS sector in a county, you can't get around some of those secondary confidentiality rules in the traditional manner. Stability, the idea of encouraging and supporting the harmonization of delineations to previous time periods. I think this is one that we see. BA has been a champion of this through things like their GDP redefinitions, where, and I remember one of the bigger redefinitions was a changing definition of looking at research and investment from a consumption activity to an investment activity. And so when this occurs, there was an importance in making sure that the time series that BA kept was reharmonized to this new definition. Okay. And I think that one, that's to be applauded. And I mean, it's usually a multi-year effort, and a lot of time and resources are dedicated to that, to go back into the original source data and recategorize items that may have been consumption to be GDP and et cetera. But that's the case. That then allows for a level of comfort to know if the current definition is the definition that is relevant for addressing the questions that we have today in regional science scholarship, then that allows us to feel comfortable with using that historical data set. We don't see similar activities occur with some of the issues that Andy Isserman would bring up when he would talk about the challenges we face in apples to oranges comparison around demographics and economics of metropolitan and non-metropolitan America, because of the shifting nature of the geography from non-metro to metro, resulting in an inability to compare unless you went back and control for it yourself. And of course, those of us that understand those issues do that. And I think those are things that we should continue to do. But the idea of supporting our statistical agencies to think about more ways they can do things I think are going to be helpful to allow us, when we're looking at today's questions and the delineations that we're using today, that we can have a constant set of definitions to be able to look at those historical data sets with a level of homogeneity to them. And then finally, the idea of relevance, supporting increased geographic precision. We have one of the challenges is heterogeneity of outcomes across the geography and the role that aggregation plays. And so some of that is linked into the issue of oversampling and accuracy. And so that comes into play. But one of the areas that I think that we can and support is the idea that it's an interesting way to think about it, but it takes some of the challenges that census has been trying to address with issues of differential privacy, but think about it in a different way. One of the issues that we often have is that we want to create our own regional categories. Maybe we want to look at a given set of regions that may be a collection of counties or a collection of census tracts or you name it, because we're wanting to look at a given type of functional relationship, and we've identified that. But because the source data is not organized that way, if we're dealing particularly with data sets that we can't recreate that ourselves, the role that modern technology can play with server-based systems and a user interface where you could provide your regional classification, sort of import that in, allow the systems to be able to evaluate that region, those regional categories, look back at the source data, and then find a way to allow for some reasonable white noise injection of that, then to then provide you a predefined, cleaned, a cleared data set. And of course, we would want to make sure as regional scientists that we'd be using that in ways that this white noise injection doesn't create problems. I mean, if we're looking at a large cross-sectional analysis where that white noise is going to balance itself out in our analysis and not create any types of bias problems, then I think those are some ways. And you know, the roles that we have as regional scientists to support these types of things, particularly in environments where our federal statistical agencies are looking for reasons for and to get additional financial support. These are the types of things that I think could help our research communities and others in regional science performing scholarship. I want to speak briefly to the current debates around metropolitan delineations and the urban definitions, because I think they sort of relate to some of the points that we talked about. And I find it's interesting, as many of us that are in regional science, we come from our perspective of how we use the data that our federal statistical agencies provide. But many of the other constituents, in cases, those in individual places that are impacted by place-based policies that are connected to these, they have their own issues that they want to bring to the table. And so the current proposed rules that OMB had for metropolitan and micropolitan areas recently ended. And it's currently open, the Census Bureau's ones for the urban definition. So you can still go in and provide comments there. But it's interesting, if you look at the comment categories that you see in those comments from metros, large numbers are actually coming from stakeholders that are in those regions that are likely to be impacted by a the changing rule, going from metro to non-metro. And despite your position about how you think the movement from 50,000 to 100,000 makes sense or not relative to that definition, when you look at the comment categories, those place-based individuals have two sort of key themed elements. It seems to, I've sort of put those together. One is around funding impacts, programs that are tied to those definitions, like community development block grant program entitlement dollars, metropolitan planning organization dollars, hospital and other healthcare organizations that get Medicare reimbursement and the impacts that has on their reimbursement rates. Those are, of course, those are the dollar elements. But then there's the second one, and it's one that I often, you know, I typically first think of it from a policy standpoint and from the standpoint of place-based investments, go right to the funding. But another subtle one that was coming up like that was the role that metropolitan had in these regions' identity. So I started to say, why would that be the case? So then I went and said, well, let me go back and look at how metropolitan is defined in a dictionary, and then sort of look at the why we might see how some of those comments are coming about. Well, metropolitan is derived from metropolis from the 14th century. This does not come from Superman comic strips. I think, yeah, Superman's Metropolis. Gotham City is Batman. Okay. And if you look at Merriam-Webster, we're talking about the chief or the capital city of a region. And this is the original 14th century definition from metropolis. It also can be a city or state of origin of a colony. The third one, the larger important city, and that one was one that I sort of came around and thought, yes, what is happening with a lot of these areas that are losing their metropolitan status is a lot of it is the idea that the definition, or at least the stakeholders that understand that definition, is there's a loss in identity that's attached to that, the value that they see in having that status. Okay, so there's part of that there. From a regional science perspective, we often like this last bullet point, a city regarded as a center of specified activity, because it fits well within our thinking of core periphery model, central place theory, et cetera. And the industrial metropolis idea works real well when we think of industrial activity being concentrated in geography and creating this core. There's people living nearby of where they work, and so there's dense population. It feels well with how OMB has created their definition from the 50s out to the present. But then right below that was, in Merriam-Webster, was a cattle metropolis. And so I said, so should we be defining feedlots in Nebraska as metropolitan areas of cattle? It was a little bit tongue in cheek, but what it did remind me is that given the purpose, and we go back to this in regional science, the functional purpose of a region matters, and how we look at that function has a large bearing on how we define that regional classification. OMB's delineations of metropolitan have been widely used to measure urban in federal and non-federal purposes, as well as, of course, leveraging those place-based policies that we said before. So as much as anything, they've often become a sort of de facto multifunctional regional classification, even though that they're primarily driven by a center of economic activity, and with the commuting percentages of outlying counties, really a labor market oriented regional functional classification. But I wanted to dig further. What might be in those value sets for why you might want to be metropolitan as opposed to non-metropolitan? Well, let's go look at some synonyms as well as some antonyms of metropolitan. And so if you look at the synonyms, we see for the most part terms that for many would not be very problematic. You have some that come off as being derogatory in the synonyms if you're not a fan of Billy Crystal and Jack Palance from the TV movie City Slickers. Quick aside, I was talking to a student that was going to work a summer at a dude ranch this summer, and asked him if he knew who Jack Palance was in the movie, and had no idea. And it's like, okay, you need to watch that. So made me feel old. Okay, but then you go look at the antonyms, and you start to see some of the terminology that was provided from Merriam-Webster, and you start to see some very derogatory type of terminologies that comes out. And so there's some identity of what people want to have classified and not. And so the idea of using metropolitan in language has implications for how people value it and their hesitancy to want to lose that identity. Despite the, and we've created this linkage between a functional region, a labor market, and a term metropolitan that has this identity that moves beyond the labor market purpose, that has values and identities that are attached. And I think as regional scientists, we have to realize that when we're dealing with things like these rule changes, is that there are multiple stakeholders that are involved, and some of the preferences that they have are based off of a different set of decision-making criteria than maybe we're looking at. Big thing to talk about here briefly is what is being proposed. This is a current map of the metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas of the United States as of March 2020. Big thing to note here is the white areas are those areas outside. One of the proposals was to generate an exhaustive classification system where every, in this case, these are counties, are assigned to a region. And of course, as regional scientists, we know that some of our regional science members and our federal statistical partners have worked on these issues over the years. Here's some Bureau of Economic Analysis areas, an exhaustive system. Again, we see one of the issues there when we look across this, we see in general, geographic areas in many of these cases can be large. They're somewhat driven by the criteria that BEA used for determining these, also dependent on the unit of geography as the building blocks, in this case, counties. And so as you move west, you get to the larger geographic counties. Anytime you combine even a small number together, they're going to make up a large geographic swath for a region. Okay, I always enjoy this one to show to students because of some of the history, which now seems a little bit dated, but it helps the idea that you don't have to have a single criteria, a single function for determining that. While you might have certain nodes and certain relationships like community that drive it, the idea that BEA would go in and use newspaper circulation. Now, of course, we laugh a little bit today with newspapers, but of course, when these were being maintained and actively updated, the idea in Louisiana, when you drive from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, which is about 85, 90 miles, is that there's a point when you get to one county, one parish, where the subscription to the Baton Rouge paper becomes less as you're driving from Baton Rouge to New Orleans than the New Orleans paper. And it's not a bad proxy for the regional identities of those places. Of course, ERS and our colleagues there have developed commuting zones over the decades, and those, again, probably the biggest difference, exhaustive, smaller number, I think it's about 175, a little over 700 here for the commuting zones in the US in this 2000 definition I'm showing here. So again, exhaustive, again, driven primarily by one labor market commuting function, but not having the residuals of the non-core regions. The question is that how do we work with a definition such as metropolitan that is so often in place-based policy being used to address place-based well-being that are those well-being is driven by multiple functions, because you may have some scenarios where you have a level of asynchronous between the place-based policy purpose and how that region was defined functionally. Okay, here are the regions, those that understand this program. These are the metropolitan areas between 50 and 100,000 that are currently being, are likely to be, if they don't see sizable growth in the current decade, to where their urbanized area population gets above 100,000, that would potentially lose that classification. If you're part of the CRENet listserv that the Applied and Ag Economics Association is a very good thread discussing this back several weeks ago with many of our regional science colleagues on both sides of this debate. Speaking real briefly with the context of time, that the urban definitions are also being changed in the spirit here of Chris Stoller. I developed a visualization. It's actually a slide of a larger video that attempts to, and I show this to my classes to help them get an idea of how the Census Bureau develops urban definitions. It's real neat when I show the video. These hexagons have these three-dimensional effects and they come up from the ground here. But the idea that the building blocks of either census blocks or census tracts, and the idea of 1,000 persons per square mile, all of those contiguous, and then you have these other contiguous census blocks or tracts of density of 500 persons per square mile. You do that until you run out of those, the 500, you sum up all the population, you get over 2,500, you're considered urban. If you're over 10,000, you become the starting point, a core of a urbanized, of a micropolitan area. If you get to 50,000, you get an urbanized area classification, and you're the starting central building block of a metropolitan area. Probably what's been talked about less, because unlike with OMB, which gave a map of who would be impacted, the Census Bureau's doesn't. some of that's driven by the fact that every decade the census blocks change a little bit, and of course they haven't imputed that. But I was a little bit surprised that they didn't attempt to take the proposed definition and backcast it on their 2010 data, similar to what they did with their differential privacy exercise. But this is what's proposed in 2020. Okay, so census is moving away from using population per square mile, and they're going to housing units, 385. And why is that number? Well, they looked at the 2019 ACS, and the average household size was around 2.6. You multiply that by 385, and you got to the 1,000. So they were attempting to hold this 1,000 persons per square mile constant, but use housing units. Why are they using housing units? Well, that data set is going to be invariant as opposed to the population, which is going to be impacted by these differential privacy rules injecting this white noise. And so I guess the Census Bureau wasn't trusting their differential privacy population for developing this. You can draw your own interpretation then of your thoughts on that, but they're doing that. And the other thing that they're doing is only the populations that fall in at 385 or above are being counted as urban. There was not a corresponding housing units per square mile below that would be equivalent to the 500 to 1,000 that was included. Now, there were some rules around adding census blocks that had certain impervious surfaces from some U.S. Geological Survey data sets that actually made it into 2010 rules. And so some of these may fit within that category, but there could be scenarios where some of those places, either urbanized areas that are just above 100,000 that were giving a sigh of relief, that they weren't going to be changed, that they may actually be impacted by these rules because this medium density is no longer going to be counted if the proposed rule change goes into play. Now, again, we don't know some of the other arcane's not the right term, the other more fine-tuned sort of rules that are not the focus of most of these definitions when we're presenting it to the general audience, might come into play and cover a lot of these, but there is that potential. So the idea of how do we deal with creating a multifunctional regional identity, and this is one of those areas. I think from a researcher standpoint as a regional scientist, I think if you're focusing on a particular research objective where the individual function is clearly defined, then you want to identify, and you're focusing on regions, you want to put the regional classification that's based off of the function. And so if the function is related to healthcare and you're dealing with something around ambulatory care, and you know that how distance impacts health outcomes, then you need to develop regions that take that into account. Labor markets, of course, we're familiar with that, but there are other types of functions that might propose different regional identities. And especially in an environment where terms like regional classifications like metropolitan result in being used to address multiple objectives that are built off multiple functions, how might we think about building a multiple functional regional identity? One of those is the idea, first, let's consider multiple functions. And in some sense, when you think back to BEA, they were doing a little bit of that. Wasn't you know, it was a little nuanced, but it did in that spirit address that. The idea, though, is that should we be considering multiple functions across the entire settlement patterns of the United States, for example, or should certain functions be a priority for certain types of settlement patterns and others less? I mean, and I would say when we look at larger urbanized areas, we have strong statistical evidence and research over years of their role in the role of labor markets in measuring well-being. And so the concept of labor markets are valuable. Now, one of our challenges with our rules is that these regions get changed up every decade, but they're not always changed up for the same regions. Sometimes outlying counties get added because people move further away from where they work. Okay. In other cases, these outlying counties get added because they don't currently either work or live in the core, but the local economic opportunities for local jobs become problematic, and there's less local jobs, so people have to commute to find work, and so these regions get built that way as well. So when does one function become less important to identity and which one becomes more important? When do we move from things like thinking of labor markets to things like trade, whether they're trades for, let's say, final consumption like households and shopping, or inter-industry trade, business to business trade? Those are important. I mean, you could often say that in certain counties in the United States that there are more cattle that may be moving across county lines from farms to auctions than there are people commuting from those same counties where they live to the county that has that auction where they may be working in a given job. So, when does that, and is there a fundamental break point where that occurs? Okay. And then second, what about culture? Culture is something that I know colleagues, my former advisor, Tom Johnson, some people at Rural Policy Research Institute have been looking at the role of cultural wealth in well-being, and how does that culture provide the types of outcomes in welfare that should be incorporated into a multifunctional regional identity. And I was trying to find this map and couldn't find it, but I remember a long time ago seeing a map, and they broke up regions of the country based off of the dominant, if there was a dominant word that was attached to business establishments. We might have seen these, used to see these with like Facebook oriented connections to universities like football teams. And so you would see, I think I saw Steve Deller earlier on the line. And so there was a lot of homogeneity around the University of Wisconsin for all counties in the state of Wisconsin. Louisiana similar for LSU. But you go to other regions and you would see a state like Alabama where 3/4 of the state would be identified with the University of Alabama. And then you have the small set of counties that would be identified with Auburn University. And you'd have the crazy cases where there were universities in Florida that were more that had identities up in New England counties, and I assume this is related to snowbird phenomenons and the like. So you'd see that. Well, this business establishment was interesting. I saw it for Louisiana because if you looked at most of the South, and it seems like, okay, this is where culture and current times sort of highlight this. So that most of the South, the dominant business establishment term that was often used in the region was Dixie. Okay, we know some of the issues around that word today, used as an adjective. But in South Louisiana, it was different. It wasn't Dixie, it was Cajun. And I can still say today that legacy is there. And so a lot of business establishments have it. So how does culture, as it generates identity and well-being, how do those get built in that? And is that function not just a function of identifying culture, but is generating welfare that is positive in the same way that income has an impact on welfare? Just something to think about. And then finally, do we want to always have some of our historical theories coming in, like central place and others with core periphery models, to be the way that we want to organize these units of analysis? Are there cases where we may look at something like natural resources, natural amenities and assets? The idea that you might have two equivalent sized towns that are nearby one another on either side of a lake, and so they're sharing a natural resource there, and so they may have much more common base on that natural resource than they would be on connectivity to with labor markets, or maybe they're connected because they sit in the same valley between a couple of mountain ranges, things of that nature. And also social capital. I know those are other ways. Those all have impacts on welfare, and those may be additional ways where we sort of put this together to identify a multifunctional regional identity that then can vary based upon where that is where that could change across the settlement patterns of the country. And I'm going to say thank you, and on behalf of the SRSA and my role in leadership, that thank you again for the opportunity to serve, as well as to present this, and appreciate everything that this organization has meant to me, both professionally and as well as developing many relationships, friendships over the years. So thanks again. I'll turn it back over to Dayton.
Thank you very much, Matt. The award session is now adjourned. Does anyone have any questions for Matt? Matt, I don't see any questions. Thanks, Matt.
I do have one question, Matt.
Steve.
The comments that were on the changing of the definition of metro, your observation that a lot of the comments were really I kind of thought of them in terms of like boosterism. And, you know, it's like, well, you can't make us a non-metro because that will harm our self-identity. You know, at the time, I kind of dismissed that, but listening to your comments, it really kind of does make a lot of sense. I wonder if you could comment on that just a little bit more.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. I think there is the research side of me, and there's the policy side that I think about in the issue. And it's like, if I was, you know, if I had the ability to single-handedly say what the definitions is like, of course, I've identified the thinking of a multifunctional identity, but, you know, how do we get to something that is going to address some of the issues that people that have this potential identity loss? How do we address that? And I think one of it is to provide not an alternative identity, but maybe an identity that provides them more peers that they identify with. One of the challenges that I think that we have with these definitions, both the urban definition and the metropolitan, and while we did a little bit of variegation with the micropolitan working down, when you looked at the 2000 definitions, what they did was that there was an attempt to try to variegate that and have some different ranges and move away from the term metropolitan. I think there was like megapolitan and a few others. I'd have to go back to the 2000 Federal Register to see the first one exactly. And they got backlash on that, and they stuck with metropolitan. But one of the things that I think is that we know functionally that when you go from 50,000 as a starting point, and you classify all of those places up to regional identities, you know, around New York City at I think it's at 19 million when you add all of that together, that functionally those areas operate differently. In fact, you can make arguments that places like New York have more connections with other world cities for certain functional purposes than they have with the surrounding counties in part of their commuting shed. And so the question is that particularly when we think about place-based policy, there's two parts. There's the money and there's the identity. And so, you can address the money as a function of how policies and programs. So, I mean, OMB says you shouldn't use this for distributing monies in programs, but that's all these agencies do it anyway. So the question is that do we see these places, particularly smaller places, if those were identified? So if you, for example, you could look at someone like the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and they have a small cities index, and they go from micropolitan places of 10,000 to 500,000, and that's their range. And I'm not saying that that's the optimal range, but it is a range to say that the functional relationships of those places, across multiple areas are different than those that are above that. Okay. In fact, you could, and so the idea, if you could create identity to say that, we are important places and our issues are different, even to the point of saying, okay, these are the traditional areas, but we know that, maybe you have greater needs in certain types of transportation than large cities. And so we need to think about how we fund those differently. If you built that and you developed identity around those, I don't think everyone wants to be New York City, but people don't want to lose the value of their place-based identity. You just need to give them something in place of that. And that's the reason that, to me, metropolitan is it's a economic labor market functional classification. And, in an ideal world, I would just eliminate the term entirely and force some boring definition for it. Labor market, region, whatever. And you still have the money attached to you. That would be one approach. The other part of that to think about, and this issue of where these places differentiate, I remember Tom Johnson showing me some research he did back in Appalachia in the late 80s and early 90s. And one of the things that he showed was this idea that certain metropolitan regions are more inward focused, meaning that what drives the economic activity for the region is focused more in the core. However, in certain Appalachian regions, the core of the metropolitan region was much more dependent on the economic activity of the periphery, or in the relative relationship. And that had impacts on how those metropolitan areas looked at their peripheries. I saw this also in a presentation that was made at the OECD World Conference in Memphis. Was it 2015, 2016, something along those lines, where there was some work in Latin America where they were looking at the role of place-based investments in regions and looking at the relationship between the central urban place and some of the outlying labor shed. And what they found was there was much more of a probability that the place would be investing in things like peripheral transportation hubs, peripheral infrastructure investments in water and utilities, when the population, and it depended on the Latin American countries, somewhere between 250 and 500,000. When you got above 500,000, there was almost always an inward focus look, and there was less desire, less probability to invest in those peripheral infrastructure investments. And so it shaped my mind to think is that, this is one of the challenges that we have in this very dichotomous relationship. You're metro or you're not, you're urban or you're not, is that when they get driven for policy, then you wind up pooling a lot of people that have very different needs. And so your policies that leverage those definitions they suboptimally accomplish their objectives because the definitions they use are so broad, and so they can't target the way that they would want to otherwise. So a long answer to your question, but it is something, and I think we have to think about that as researchers. I mean, I appreciate, for example, and Steve, you were involved in those CRENET discussions, Mark Partridge's points. The question in my mind, and I even cited him in the public comment I submitted, was, should we try to maintain the character of metropolitan from 1950, or is that how we want to look at a core today? Okay, because yes, the cores in 1950 along the coasts, those look very traditional, but when you move into the flyover country, for lack of a better term, how metropolitan areas, the built environment will look much different. And these rules that are being applied look very much like rules that are consistent with these very historical views of urban and metropolitan, and not looking at some of the unique characteristics that we see in our settlement patterns in the US, the heterogeneity.
Matt, I have a question for you.
Yes.
So what advice could you give to a early career researcher on operationalizing the concept of regional identities into their research program?
Here's the thing. I mean, first of all, the biggest thing is don't get lazy with getting to try to quickly get to running models and developer research. Think carefully about the choice of region. And even if that requires more effort to sort of construct your data in a different regional classification, if you have the source data to build those blocks up, take that decision seriously, okay? So I would definitely say do that. Second, understand the limitations of some of your of the regional data that you have, and this is the and this is the point, and I made this in a book chapter. It's coming out soon. Is that one of the challenges that I have with the metro and micro definitions, and particularly using ACS data, is that, and even some of the proposals that we're continue using its current form, is that it can create a lot of unneeded volatility because of the choice of how it's being used. So if you're taking a point estimate on a commuting pattern between a very remote rural county and a larger sort of urban core county, you don't have a lot of people, and so when you go into the Great Plains and you look at the confidence interval around some of those ACS commuting, I mean they can be 15 and 20%. Okay, so what is happening? Well, you cannot really have any structural changes in commuting patterns, but let's say that the confidence interval is 9% confidence interval between 20 and 30%. And in 2010, the point estimate was 26%, which is above the 25% threshold. And in 2020, it's 23%. Okay, confidence interval stays the same. We have created unneeded volatility by the only taking into account the point estimate and not the full structure of the data. And I think that that's important as well. Is that that's one of the things that I suggested, was that particularly with between census changes, if they're going to go with continuing to use ACS, these intercensual updates, particularly when they're changing outlying counties, is that they need to take into account how much is true structural changes versus what are artifacts of using the sampling procedures, and leverage more of the data that's available there. So those are a couple of things that a researcher should consider.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions?
I see Randy Jackson has a hand up. Is that correct?
Looks like it.
Hi, Matt. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I want to apologize for being late to the awards. I almost never have trouble with Zoom, but today I did, and ended up 7 minutes late and missed my chance at stardom on announcing the Mirnick Award. And I just want to say congratulations again in person. One of the things that your presentation reminds me of, Matt, is the fact that early on in regional science, there was a much stronger representation from geographers. Mm-hmm. And I think that the association suffers somewhat from the decline in participation from geographers. Regional definition, all of these things go back to discussions in the 50s and 60s about functional economic areas. What's the purpose behind the definitions? How do we best identify a study region for a particular problem domain? I remember formula like trying to maximize the ratio of intra to inter regional interactions when you define your regional boundaries. But there's a large foundation of concepts that were developed really jointly between regional economists and economic geographers back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And we tend, unfortunately, to forget about a lot of that. I guess my bottom line message is, if we have a chance at our own institutions to encourage geographers to become more active in regional science again, I think that the organization or that the field generally, not just the organization, but the field of regional science will benefit from a stronger participation from geographers. They tend to be much more capable in terms of their GIS skills, in terms of any number of different geographically specific kinds of tasks. And I would just call for all of us to try to be more proactive when we think about recruiting people to participate in regional science. I think we need to recall the roots of regional science and the fact that there has been traditionally a much stronger, or historically anyway, a much stronger participation on the part of geographers in our group. But I really enjoyed your presentation. I love to see the attention placed there again, Matt. Yeah. Well done.
Yeah, thank you. And that's one of those areas. In fact, in 2019, when I was program chair, I was desperately trying to get the chair of the committee, the committee that defines those, who's I think it's James Fitzmaurice, to come and do a session on it and really work. So we had a census partner, and they organized some sessions. Unfortunately, we competed that week with AAG, American Association of Geographers, and the slot that I had available, he was presenting at the exact time window at AAG, and so I couldn't get him over to facilitate a session on it. But it does speak to the need to bring that discipline back into our group of scholars, because I think they will help us work through some of the challenges that we face, given our some of us particularly come from economics as our discipline, some of our potentially narrow thinking about how we put these regions together and both think favorably or unfavorably about certain types of regional identities. So thanks again for that comment. Appreciate it, Randy.
Okay, we're moving on to the next session. It's 12:45 Eastern Standard, so time to move on. I adjourn the meeting, and have a great day, the rest of you.
Thanks.
Take care.